Hello, friends and enemies, heroes and villains. Welcome to Epic Realms. Today's guest is a USA Today best-selling author, Nebula Award nominee, and co-owner of Atheon Books Publishing. Please welcome the one and only Rhett C Bruno. How are you doing? Welcome on in. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm doing fine, ready to go.
Awesome. Let's talk real quick about, and I'm going to pronounce it wrong a couple times here. Athon Books, Athon.
Oh, you got it.
I got
Athon,
it.
yeah, you got it right.
All right. Let's talk about that. How did that come to be? How did that come about? And tell our audience a little bit about it.
Yeah, so I think we started, it was like 5 years ago.
Okay.
At that point, I was a fairly successful author. My co-owner, Steve Boyer, was a fairly successful author, and we did a lot of work together, and we always sort of bounced the idea around of starting a publisher ourselves. We had a lot of contacts and knowledge in the audio side of things that we knew we could help, and of course ebook too, because we had sold a lot of our own stuff. And I'd worked with traditional publishers like Random House and other small publishers, and done a lot of indie stuff. So we'd kind of seen every side of the industry. Um, and then he got laid off from his job one day. I didn't like my day job, so he was like, "Do you want to do this?" And I was like, "Sure." So I went part time like that week, and we started building it. Like 4 months later, I quit my job, and we had started it off of like a $4,000 Kickstarter.
Oh wow. What was kind of the goal with that? Like what were you doing and planning to do that was different than what everyone else was already doing?
Obviously, audio was a big focus for us. So like 5 years ago, audio, especially for indies, was really starting to explode, and we were kind of at the ground floor of that happening, of working with all the different audio publishers, of doing it ourselves and treating it as an equal right to ebook. So we started synchronizing our launches on all the formats, and you know really focusing on all of the digital things instead of just ebook. Like we had seen all the big four digital only imprints, they really only focus on ebook and they ignored audio, which is like the same amount of profit. um,
Yeah.
that was what we wanted to do, was sort of take a very traditional deal where we handle the rights, pay for everything, do everything, covers, editing, but treat each book with an indie mindset. So it's for someone else, but as if we were self-publishing our own book, and treat it like our own. So that was kind of how it started, and how we've always gone. Just really trying to exploit rights for every single author, and focus on all we could do digitally, not just one thing.
Yeah. That's really cool. How did you approach other authors? Because obviously there's just the two of you starting off. Did you already like we know a bunch of people that are already going to be in and jump on
Yeah,
board?
so we had been in the community for a while. I started like a science fiction and fantasy newsletters thing where I was basically just promoting other authors for free, building up the list, Sci-Fi Bridge and Fantasy Bridge, what they were called. And so as I was building that, we gained just a lot of indie contacts. And as we were building that up, I met a lot of authors who were like, I really like the writing part. Um, Maybe they launched at like the start of KU and they got really lucky with a hit, but they didn't know how to sustain that success because they didn't really want to do any marketing or anything. And so a lot of our first authors were friends who didn't want to have to sell their own thing. They just wanted to write
Yeah.
their own books. Like our first big signing was Paul Anthony Jones, who's passed now, but was a 47 North author who they just passed on his next thing. They didn't want it. They'd offered him no explanation. So there's a lot of that type of author that we started working with. And as we were successful with them, more approached. So we sort of have a two-pronged thing. We have a traditional submissions portal that a lot of people reach out to, that we review and all that. But we do a lot with referrals and friends and people being brought to our attention as well. So we're kind of 50-50 on those two things. But at the start, it was really just a lot of people we knew we could help them because they didn't want to do the business of writing. They just wanted to write.
Yeah. Did it grow from just the two of you, or is it still just the two of you?
So no, we have editors, we have artists on set, we have assistants and all sorts of stuff. I mean, we are proud that we're fully independent still. We don't have investors or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
So everything, I like to say when we sign people, like we don't deal with an in between or anything. You deal with me or you deal with Steve. We're the two ones. in charge and we give you an answer that is final. You don't have to go through intermediaries or anything like that.
Yeah.
But no, at this point, we have a team. We have people checking submissions for us, all sorts of editors
Did you have all
and
that
stuff.
when
But
you
we
started lined up? When you like, did you have that lined up, or was that did you have a
no,
plan goal or?
when we started, we were editing every book ourselves, um, finding artists, getting everything made just based on using money to do it and spending where we thought it would be worth it. And some connections to get editors and stuff. Basically, people we had worked with before.
Yeah.
But no, our first few authors, a lot of them, we edited each book ourselves, and that was from our first book to even like guys like Rick Partlow, who's become one of our most prolific sci-fi authors. His first series, I edited myself, and as we grew, we started to realize, if we want to have a business, we can't be editing everyone's books ourselves. We have to
Yeah.
bring on editors because it just is too much work.
When you started it, it sounded like it was kind of like a sci-fi fantasy kind of theme, but it seems to have branched out. I know one of our authors that have been on the show I mentioned beforehand, uh, Hunter Blaine. It has like a superhero book. You have listed on there like
Well, we've
thrillers
always
and
done
everything.
superhero for sure. Is we tie right into that. We don't do too much of it, but I wrote a superhero book called The Roach. My partner writes superhero book called Raptors. Like, so we've always been into that genre. It's just a real tough genre
Yeah.
it doesn't have a book market really.
Right.
But yeah, our real focus has always been science fiction and fantasy. At the start, mostly science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's pretty even. We do a lot of fantasy, a lot of progression fantasy with RPG. Sci-fi, we do a lot of military, space opera, post-apocalyptic, all those sort of main commercial things under those umbrellas. We started to do some thrillers.
Mm-hmm.
It really We found that there was a lot of crossover in that market and military science fiction. So
Yeah.
we're doing some, but definitely still our focus is science fiction and fantasy. Probably outside thriller, there's not really another genre we would do that we would feel comfortable knowing how to sell.
Right. Because that's the thing,
It
right? A lot
was
of publishers like, this is what we sell, this is what we know, this is what we're good at. If somebody comes in, they're like, I want to pitch you this romance, you're like, well, we'll send you over here because they know how to do that the best for you. Is that kind of something you
yeah,
guys are doing?
yeah. I mean, we get our website is very clear about what we look at. We get the weirdest submissions all the time in all sorts of different genres. So it's hard to say, but yeah, I mean, I don't really know any romance publishers, so we just tend to ignore those submissions because I don't know why they're sending them to
Right,
us.
right.
But we try to be honest and forthright about if we don't know how to sell things. And look, like we know how to sell science fiction and fantasy. We're learning how to sell thrillers, but every genre is very, very different.
Yeah,
The methods of promotion and marketing that work are different, even in subgenres, like between the military and space opera, lit RPG, and standard epic fantasy. Like the way that we have to promote them is totally different and custom. So yeah, we try to stay in our lane, just like we focus on digital because print isn't a game we think that independent publishers are going to be able to have a stake in. So
right.
instead of focusing a ton of efforts on something that won't work in the end, like print for us is a side thing. We do it, it makes the product looks great, but we know we're not going to get distribution on the shelves because
Yeah.
only the big four does really.
Are you hoping that someday that's something you guys can look into doing a bit more of? Or are you just like
Not
not even,
really.
oh, okay.
At this point, with the way the industry is, no one really can.
Yeah,
And I've seen a lot of small publishers push and try and go that route. And I've seen a lot of small publishers bankrupt themselves with the returns and everything.
yeah,
And print right now to get on shelves, at least in the US, is a game that takes a massive multi-million-dollar corporation that can handle the distribution, has the shelf space reserved, can handle the return, which is the biggest thing, right? Like you
yeah,
could get when a book goes out for sale, if it doesn't sell, the bookstore can return it at full price to the publisher, and like you could wake up on the hook for hundreds of thousands of dollars for a
yeah,
book that didn't sell. It's not a game we think we could play, and our release style, like there are certain ways to release in print that don't work in our way, which is why instead of trying to emulate the big four and even how we release, like we don't do that. We do our own thing that focuses on the digital aspect
Yeah.
because they are very different.
Do you give the authors the chance to like, get a bunch of print copies and go to conventions and sell print copies on
Yeah, I mean,
Amazon and that kind of stuff?
if they want, we can get author copies for authors for like 40 to 50% of what their list price is.
Okay.
We tell them if you want to go to an event, buy them from us, sell them for whatever you want. Keep the money. Like
Yeah.
we aren't sticklers for that. We just did Dragon Con, which was a lot of fun, and moved a lot of print copies with all the authors. And in the end, like, no, it wasn't about the money. Like we sell way more digital copies
Yeah.
per day than we did in the entire time of Dragon Con. But
What?
being out there, it's about meeting. You might meet a super fan and stuff like that, and those
Right.
types of things.
Well, it sounds like you really want to help the other authors too. Obviously, it's a business, but like you're there also for the other authors and to help people grow as well. So that's really awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it was really fun to see a bunch of authors trying to sell their own books and everything. And but we try to be upfront and honest with our authors about where we think they're going to make a living from and where they're going to have fun and sort of try to make some super fans a connection.
Yeah. You have a book that's recently come out. September 19th, I believe, was your Eighth Continent book that just came
Yes.
out. And that's part of this series, a whole series, right? You got that comes out, and then October and November, another, each one in that series,
Yeah,
right?
so we built it up. Me and Felix R. Savage worked on it together. Honestly, we wrote it like 2 years ago. That's how we built up all the releases. And then at the audio deal, and like there was some shake up with the narrator and stuff. So it's been in the process for a really long time. We wanted to try this sort of rapid release thing that just with how busy I am, I'm not usually able to do. So
Yeah.
it takes a while to build it up. But yeah, that's been going really well. It's a fun sort of conspiracy story about a construction team on the moon that is selling pretty decently, and people can read the full series really, really fast. But yeah, no, that's been a lot of fun. It was my first time trying hard science fiction. Um, Felix is very smart on that side of things. I try to admit where I'm not smart. So if I write a military sci-fi, I usually write it with someone who's military.
Yeah.
So writing it with Felix is I leave story and stuff and character stuff to me, but the hard science is him and like he had a scientist advising us and all sorts of stuff.
That's
So
awesome.
it's fun to delve into that side of the genre because it's something that alone I know I couldn't write because I'm just not
Yeah.
a scientist.
Right. That's understandable. Uh, you mentioned you're co-owner of the Athon Books a little bit ago, and many people probably don't know his author name as easily, and maybe they do. But tell us a little bit about how you guys knew each other, got to know each other
Yeah,
before
so
that.
Steve Bollier co-owns Athon with me. He also writes under Jamie Castle, so that's how we met. So Sci-Fi Bridge, which I talked about earlier,
Mm-hmm.
was like a promotional platform I created. Um, and I needed a logo at a time, and the guys I started with knew Steve, and one of them was like, "Hey, Steve, he's a graphic designer." So he was like, "Hey, Steve can make this logo." And so we started talking about it. I just wound up hitting it off as friends, and I was writing the Luna Missile Crisis. I was trying to write it. It's a book I wrote. It's an alternate history set during the Cold War, where aliens interrupt the Cold War, and like the U.S. and USSR are trying to figure out how to both win over the respect of the aliens. Unfortunately, I'm 33, so I wasn't born in the 60s, and I had never really written on Earth before. Like I've written epic fantasy, I've written far future science fiction, but never something grounded on Earth.
Right.
Um, and something that was so like pulpy and humorous at a certain level. And so he read it, and he was a pastor, and one of the characters was meant to be like was a very religious veteran. And so I asked him if he wanted to help me try to write this because I had like the whole thing outlined and written, and I loved the idea, but I just couldn't get through it. So that was the first thing we did was we wrote the Luna Missile Crisis. We wrote a version. The version that's out, it took us probably 2 years of revisions and everything to get right. Like it was the hardest book I've ever had to write. And as we were doing it together, like we just became close friends and sort of discuss publishing and everything. So that was how it started, and we went from that to write a 6 book fantasy series together. We've written science fiction together, a weird western together. So it's easy to write with someone when you co-own a business because we're basically always talking to each other about
Right.
business stuff. Then when you're writing, you just switch over to talking about that. So yeah, it just grew naturally from there. But yeah, we met just because I needed a logo and someone referred him to me as a graphic designer. So
That's awesome.
you,
What is the process for you guys? Because you guys are writing books together. You did that one, you did the Black Badge series, which we'll talk about here in a second. What is the process for that? Because everybody that co-writes, it seems like they mention a kind of a different process for doing it. Sometimes it's
so
like each person does their own character, like perspective, or they just take turns taking chapters. How do you guys do it?
so it really depends. Like we know a ton of co-authors. In most cases, they're doing it to try to be faster because speed sells in the indie market like 100%. Me and Steve are not faster. when we when we co-write, it depends on what we're writing. So we wrote Luna Missile Crisis in our fantasy series. There were multiple point of views, so we each took a point of view and went with that. But like, we don't just write a whole bunch and hand it off. Like every chapter, we're going back and forth. Like Steve always says, we touch 100% of every word in the books we write together. Like if I write alone, I have a voice. If he writes alone, he has a voice. Together, we have a different voice. That's how differently we write together. It's not something I would recommend to someone who's co-writing to try to pump out content. Like when it's with other people, I tend to be more their like developmental storyboarding type editor and like get a rough draft and then edit it through it and stuff like that. With Steve, we're kind of building properties ground up, back and forth it. Right. And then we wrote our weird Western series, Black Badge, which is
Yeah,
first person, which
yeah,
is very hard to write together in. So essentially it's like us going back and forth with ideas. Like one of us will have an idea for the next part, write it, the other person will write into it. It's just a constant back and forth to the point where that character's voice, neither of us would be able to write it alone because
yeah.
we've basically just been going back and forth so much on creating his first person voice. So yeah, I mean, we are different depending on really the point of view that we're writing in
Yeah. But you guys
and how many
mingle.
characters. And
You guys mingle that story and those characters so well. Usually, like when I read a book that's two authors, I can usually tell, especially if they're authors I know. I can tell I'm like, okay, this is Delilah S. Dawson and this is Kevin Hearn. I can tell, between the
yeah,
chapters. But with this, you can't tell. Like it's like, how are they doing this? How is
and
this two
that's why I'm
people?
saying it's not something I'd recommend for making money, for selling fast or anything, because it does take longer. Like we just take I could write a book alone faster than when we work together, but I think we create a sort of a special type of voice that we couldn't do all by ourselves. But yeah, it definitely takes longer, and we work really hard to make sure you can't read who wrote what. We both wrote everything. Like
Yeah,
even one person rough drafted it. It's then been butchered apart by both of us and put back together until it's the right voice. Um, so yeah, I mean that's our goal. It's cool to hear you say that because it is what we really focus on. But again, I think it depends. Like we run Athon. When we started it, it was supposed to be our side thing. Now writing is our side thing for sure.
yeah, yeah,
And Athon is like our super intensive full-time job. So, we aren't writing for making a living, which is a very different approach than a writer who is writing for making a living. And
yeah.
whenever I talk to authors and I'm talking about a deal or signing them and stuff like that, it's always an important thing I ask them is what they're aiming for because it has to affect how you approach it.
The other thing about the Black Badge series that really stands out to me is your audiobook narrator. And I was looking and looking at your list of audiobook narrators, and those that are listening to the show, they know that I'm a big audiobook person. Like I love audiobooks. You talked about how Atheon really wants to do a lot more digital, and you don't get much better digital than basically a movie in your ears. And so you got, let's run down this list real quick. So Black Badge series has Roger Clark, who many people know as Arthur Morgan from Red Dead Redemption. Amazing, amazing voice. Perfect for the series, by the way.
Yeah.
You've
Well, we wrote it with him, knowing it was going to be him, so that
Oh, that's
helps.
even better. That's even better.
Yeah,
Uh, you had the series with Will Wheaton and Catherine McName, I can't think.
McNamara. Yeah,
McNamara, yeah. You had that series, which is the Vicarious, and you had those two in there. You've had Luke Daniels did the Buried Goddess series. You had Ray Porter. You've had R.C. Bray. I mean, you're talking about like the 5-star Michelin audiobook narrators that are out there right now. Like these are the best ones, and you've got pretty much all of them. I don't think there's another author I can think of off the top of my head who have had this many. How do you do that? Was that just like a major key, or what was your hand in that? Tell us a little
I'd
bit about that.
I'd like to say it's on purpose. Obviously, owning a company who's very large in the audio part helps. Of course, Athon didn't exist when I got RC Bray for the Children of Titan series. I was just sort of I wanted him for it. I thought he'd be a great fit. He really liked it and went for it. Same as the Roach, which he did. And Luke Daniels was we sold that series at Audible Studios, and they actually it's so funny because they gave us auditions from him, Ray Porter, and Oliver Wyman. And Luke was Steve's favorite narrator, so we chose him.
Yeah,
But that was like we didn't request those three; they just gave us those three, which is cool. So, but after those, I mean, yeah, like getting Will Wheaton and Catherine, who's an actress, was a that was during COVID, and actors had nothing to do, so we made a big push. Athon, we worked with companies. I mean, we had Felicia Day do a book. Like I had Lou Diamond Phillips do a book of mine because we did a book of his. Like when they couldn't work, we were looking at a lot of those narrators to do stuff.
that's awesome.
And then Ray Porter, we wanted him for Luna Missile Crisis from the start. If the agent for Dennis E. Taylor happens to be my agent, so I was, using that connection, we were able to sort of talk to Ray and get Ray. So connections in this industry absolutely help. There's a ton of great narrators besides these big people out there, though.
Right.
Again, like half of them for me were luck, half were timing and targeting them. We get a lot of huge narrators for people all the time. We've built up a lot of narrators. So yeah, it's cool to have that list. I think Steve's list is even more impressive. He's like an audiophile. He listens to multiple books a week, so he always says like he wants to collect all his favorite narrators for his own stuff. Um, but me, I like to get just focus on who I think is going to do the best job. I don't release as many books as him. Roger Clark again. It was a situation where we had a weird Western novella with Audible originals. And we were both like, oh, who'd be good at this? I was like, I wonder if the guy from Red Dead Redemption narrates because we were playing the game at the time.
Yeah.
And so we emailed them and they're like, yeah, he does some books. And so that's how we got obsessed. And that's one thing authors should know. Half of getting the narrator or whatever anything in this industry is just asking
Yeah.
because most times authors don't ask. So you get a list of some auditions and you pick one. But like if you ask and that person's available, they're happy not to think about who to audition.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like as long
Exactly.
as you're being reasonable, like certain narrators are just unavailable. Like RC Bray is just really hard to get anymore. Things like that. But if they're available and their price isn't insane, which if they're not a celebrity, they're mostly gettable by these audio publishers. You just have to ask.
Yeah.
And that is something we've put into Athon is even when we sublicense out, we retain narrator approval because we try to ask for the best possible person.
That's great. Are you hands on with the audiobook narrator at all, or is it just like you're done and you're just like, here, go? Or does
Um,
it depend on the
so I
narrator?
we have a whole audio team, and yeah, it definitely does. Um, Again, we try to get pronunciation lists from our authors and everything, and some are really can be picky about certain voices they want. And if it's a newer narrator, we'll send that list. But if it's Ray Porter, and the author's trying to say like, oh, I'll tell him what I want to sound like. My answer is going to be, look, he's going to sound like Ray Porter, and however Ray Porter wants to perform this book.
Yeah.
And we don't really feel comfortable pushing him
Yeah. Be
to
happy it's
narrate a
Ray
certain way
Porter.
because yeah, because he just doesn't do that. And some narrators are really famous and they ask and they want all the information because they want to do that. And they all have different styles. I mean, we know narrators who prep read the book twice before reading it.
Yeah.
We know narrators who don't want to prep. They want the honest, raw interpretation of the book.
Yeah.
And yes, in the end, sometimes that leads to errors. Like they say, give someone a certain voice and then change a voice because they forgot they already gave that character a voice and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And if you really listen close to the audiobooks, you'll notice that in like a lot of them. But they usually give a really raw and emotional performance. So yeah, I mean, it depends. If it's a narrator who we're trying to groom and help build up their following, we'll be a lot more hands-on. Um, and typically they need it because there'll be more proofing mistakes and things like that. But yeah, we try to be custom to who it is.
What was kind of your first intro into writing books? Like obviously you've been writing since you're little kid, right? But what was your like, I'm going to publish this book or I'm going to, get published, and then, what kind of started that ball rolling?
So I was in like high school. I was probably like 15 or 16, and I started writing a fantasy trilogy. I can't even look at it now; it's horrible. But I went and like my parents were helping me because I didn't know what to do with it. Back then, and again, it wasn't that long ago, but KU, Kindle Unlimited, and Kindle KDP and stuff were really didn't really get big until based on what we said, like 2014 or so.
Mm-hmm.
And this was like 2007, 2008. So my parents helped me and we found some vanity publisher. We did it through them and we thought it was cool. And like, I didn't know what the vanity publisher, I don't even say who they are anymore. The owners are in jail because they were exploiting people. So when I say I've seen every side of publishing, like, while that sucked and it was shitty to just get taken advantage of by a vanity publisher,
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad it happened because it shows you who's doing right. Like
Yeah.
when people say, don't sign with someone who's making you pay up front, you're like, oh, but what if it's something like, no, don't. This is exactly why, because they're just collecting checks and vanishing on people.
Yeah.
So that was my first thing was a fantasy trilogy that I published at like 16 and no one really read and all that. So yeah, that kind of sucked. And after that, I kind of dedicated myself to actually like having my work critiqued, short stories, critique groups, putting it out there for feedback and stuff like that. Because when you're that age and you're writing alone, unless you're on the internet getting feedback, you're showing parents and friends and people that are never going to give you an honest opinion.
Right.
And I say that any aspiring author, as awesome as your parents might be or your friends might be, they can't be unbiased. They just can't. And the best way for you to improve as a writer is to put it in front of strangers
Yeah.
because, yeah, some of them are going to be assholes. And I've had more than a few. And those, in those situations, you have to like look between the lines for any valuable insight. But it's the only way you're going to get honest opinions. Even if they're not spending money, they're taking their time to read your work. And people who read stuff for free tend to be even meaner than people who are willing to spend money.
Yeah.
So that's an awesome way to grow as a writer. Obviously, reading, like I went back and started reading a lot of science fiction and fantasy where, during high school, I didn't want to read because they made us read crap that I didn't want to read.
Right. It was the
And,
best of times. It
and,
was the worst of times.
and I really think like, look, I was fine. I did great in school. Like I didn't mind it or anything. But when it comes to reading, I think they should offer more optional reading because they really make you hate reading unless you're into that literary stuff.
Yeah.
And so I just like stopped reading, and then it was like sophomore year in college. I was like, oh, like I can read things I want to
Yeah.
now. That's kind of cool. Maybe I'll try that. And that, helped me actually discover that I wanted to write science fiction. Like after that, I wrote a ton of science fiction, which I hadn't before. So those are two really important things for sure, is to really show people what you're working on.
When you got that, realized that in school, where it's like, oh, I can read whatever I want to read. What was the book that you're like, oh, this is the book? Do you know it? Like for me, I was very much the same. I didn't want to read anything, and then we had to do like a book report thing of whatever we wanted, and I picked up a Wizard of Earthsea, and I was like, this is really cool. Can I do this one? They're like, sure. I'm like, really? I can do this? Was there like a book for you that like really you could go back
Yeah,
and go,
so
this was the book?
it's a live action character who just got revealed as I read Heir to the Empire. I was like, I love Star Wars. Why don't I try reading this first Star Wars book?
Yeah,
And so that I read that whole series, and then I read like the Bane series and a bunch of series, and then I went on and started reading a lot of like Heinlein and Philip K. Dick and the classic guys. Um, so yeah, it was Heir to the Empire that where I was really like, oh, I could read something I want to read. Like
yeah,
I like Star Wars. This guy's writing is awesome. Like let's go for it. So that was the book, which is pretty cool now that I know Timothy's on now, which is
yeah.
cool.
That's awesome.
But like to see that character come to life now is also was a pretty cool thing to see because that was like the first written character that I really loved.
That's exciting. What do you think would be your first super well known book? Would it be like the Titanborn series, or was there one before that?
Um, Depends on the format. So Web of Eyes in our fantasy series
Okay, the Buried Goddess
came
series.
out came out before that and did really really well in audio. It
Yeah,
just never picked up that well off anywhere else. Um, the Titan series is probably my best known series, like definitely the most readers. So yeah, it's between those two,
between those two.
and it really depends on the format, whether it's audio versus ebook print.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was between those two, and again, they kind of came out at a very similar time.
Well, with the Buried Goddess, how did you deal with character development in that? Because you have some very distinct characters in that book series. Whether it's the roguey character, all the different characters that are in there. How do you develop them? Because obviously they change as the story progresses.
Um,
Or has it
I
been
wish
so
I
long?
knew. No, it's not that it was so long. Is me and Steve spent so much time writing that series and like just going back through each book and pouring over it and like we like this we've written a bunch of stuff since and we always go back to that as our favorite thing to have written because like you said the characters in the first book are so different than the characters same people in the sixth
Yeah,
book but they're the same people but they've sort of changed so much and a lot of that was we didn't outline that really at all like the characters was pantsed sort of but like we literally wrote them to each other like when I said we would write different point of views like it's an epic fantasy series so the
yeah,
first book really only has two point of views so that was sort of like people always review that the worst because it is a simpler fantasy story that leads into everything else
yeah,
and as it became more epic we were both juggling different point of views and we had an overall outline of where the story would want to go but Steve might write something with another character that completely changed what I had to do with this character and so when I say that the characters were actually evolving and growing themselves it was literally because we were writing them separately then coming together with no
yeah.
outlines so the characters themselves were literally reacting
To the
to what
situation.
happened
Yeah.
and the funniest part is for so long I didn't know this until like book 5 or 6 so Steve was rolling for them like D&D. Like if it was D20, he would kill someone else. And I didn't know this the whole time. And so literally his roles were changing the story in drastic ways as it was going. And I was having to recover with my character and change stuff. And we reached a point in book 6 where I was like, Steve, this one character needs to die. And he was like, no, he can't die. I love him so much. And I was but that's the story. He has to die. And so he's like, fine. So he rolled and it landed on D20. And so we actually did it. But after like 5 books, Dice were deciding the fate of every character in that series when they reached a perilous moment. And I had no idea. And I was just reacting to that.
When did you find out, and how did you find out? Like, did he tell you, and you're like, wait, what?
I found out when I said that that one main character had to
Okay.
die, which was as we were planning to
Okay.
finally write the final book. And that was when he rolled for that character. I was like, "What have you been doing this whole time?" He's like, "Yeah, that's why the so and so died in book three." I was like, "Oh my god, that changed the entire series." And so yeah, it was. I think those characters evolved so well, just in the style we wrote it was literally reacting to each other. Every other chapter, we would write it, hand it back, be like, "Holy crap, I need to change everything now." And that was everything from story to even battle scenes. Like if one person wrote something, if the other character wound up in it, they were then placed in a position that you weren't sure they were going to be, and you had to react. So it was really, really fun to write, and I think very hard to write. It took us a long time just to make everything work out.
It's one of my favorite themes to have. It's you've got Whitney Firestorm, who's the like the rogue of the party. You were talking about
Yeah,
D&D, and he's stuck with this basically a paladin, and they have to do stuff together, and they're like dynamic opposites, but they still have to get along. And it's such a I love that in book. There's very few books that do that, and you guys do it very well. I loved it. So people who are
well, I
listening,
can
go check
announce.
it out.
I am allowed to announce something. I'll give it to you since we haven't announced it anywhere.
All right.
So that series is getting a webtoon original.
Oh,
So it's going to be a comic, which is
okay.
really exciting because it's a series, like I said, that we love, and it's done. Like there's nothing else we could do with it now. But now we're going to be able to work with an art team to kind of bring it
Into a different.
to that new medium and sort of show people the story from beginning to end again. So
How are people
that
going to
should
be
be
able to
really
find that
cool.
or read that?
On Webtoon site.
The
So
webtoon site.
it'll be a
Okay.
while.
Okay.
It's gonna be a while. Probably not till late next year that it starts coming out because there's so much that goes into those. But we're really excited because, like I said, no matter what we write, like we keep going back to that as our favorite story that we've ever written.
Yeah. Do you know like what the do you know like what the art's going to look like? Is it going to be color, black and white,
Yeah,
anything
so
like
it'll
that?
be like most things in Webtoon. It's going to be universal style art.
Okay.
Um, so everything on that site that sells well is really a similar style.
Okay.
We know more. We know like who the art studio and stuff will be that we're
That's
not allowed
already.
to say yet.
Yeah.
But
No, that's
yeah,
awesome. That's amazing.
it's gonna be really fun.
Children of Titan series. Tell us a little bit about that one because obviously you mentioned it's a toss up between the two of them. This is one that I personally haven't read, so I need you to tell our audience all about the things.
So that's an interesting series because I wrote book one actually for Random House.
Okay.
Um, and I wrote book one, and it's essentially a story of it's set like 300 years from now. Think an expanse like universe is all set in our solar system. So, like the expanse, but a little more broken down. Like Earth was really destroyed, so it's kind of more survival. Like everyone's more focused on survival, but advanced to that level where they're spread throughout our whole solar system. And it's about an aging bounty hunter who winds up witness to a terrorist attack on Earth from they're called ringers. They're basically people that live on Titan that are starting to want to separate based on the history of they wound up there escaping an asteroid that hit Earth. Earth was supposed to die, but not everyone died. So Earth rebuilt. And then the two cultures came together and were totally different by that point. How they looked, how they acted. So think like the Belters and the Expanse, but next level. Like they've been apart. They weren't discriminated for 300 years. They were totally apart and then randomly came together, sort of like Europeans and natives. So it's about an aging bounty hunter trying to hunt them down, and that's essentially book one is him trying to get to the bottom of it, finding it, and find out like what was really behind this attack, and sort of finding his sympathy, even though he's been a corporate follower his whole life. So it's supposed to be one book, but as I finished the first book, I had a really good idea for the other side, showing the terrorists that he was after and how they wound up where they were. And that sort of the whole thing evolved into a series that instead of showing the rebellion, was about sort of the birth of this rebellion
Okay.
and kind of taking a bad guy and him finding his heart, and taking a good guy and him finding his way to being in charge of this rebellion. I always compare it to like the fall of Anakin, but without awful writing and dialogue, hopefully. And like a reason beyond just visions, like based on heartbreak and everything. So it's really about showing trauma. And so each book is sort of a science fiction Greek tragedy that's building up towards a tragedy that's going to keep plunging them further down. So that was sort of my big series that I wrote on my own. Again, another one that was very hard to write. Each character is first person, so it even goes back and forth between first person, which really limited the scope of the story. But I had to use tricks to kind of be able to tell more about this growing rebellion. But yeah, it's really a story about two individuals wrapped up in this growing rebellion rather than the war itself. It's really about them and their trauma in this. So it was very, very hard to write. It took me years and a bunch of rewrites and everything. I love it. I mean, it's a really, really heartfelt, like personal story about a broken down guy.
Yeah.
Um, and I even got so far. It ended after 4 books, and I was like, oh, I have to do something with a fifth, and wrote a fifth that's sort of 5 years in the future and brings everything wrapped up to its end.
Right.
But yeah, it's meant to be sort of this big, gritty science fiction epic. Epic as in its focus on two characters, taking them from like really you experience what they've experienced from birth until how they end in the rebellion.
How do you how do you grow as a writer? I mean, obviously, these books you said it was really hard to begin. What kind of developments do
Yeah.
you look back on and go, man, I learned this from these books, or I learned these from these books, and up till now, where it's
Um,
like you're probably a way different writer than you were when you first started.
yeah, I think like reading a lot of stuff, it almost just happens and you don't even realize
Hmm.
improving. Um, Important for me was editing. Like, some authors really only want copy edits done, and that's fine, and they're really precious about their words. Nothing helped me more than in, like, my first science fiction series, I had an amazing editor through a publisher that just butchered it and, like, broke it down and showed me how to improve it, how to make the dialogue feel more real and everything, and I think that helps, like, really, really getting someone to react to every paragraph you write
Yeah,
and tell you ways they think that it can be better, and not trying to rewrite your work, but trying to get you to find the perfect version of this work. I think that's why I always tell people, like, if you want to grow as a writer, show it to people who are strangers who are going to critique the shit out of it.
yeah,
And for every 90% of garbage reaction, 10% is going to be great stuff, because in the end, you aren't writing for you.
yeah,
If you want, you're writing for readers to read this book for a certain market, or for everyone if you want to be super commercial. But yeah, that my editor with Diversion Books was really helpful. My editor with Random House was really, really, really helpful. Um, and writing with Steve is really, co-writing is great if it's not a situation where it's just one person rough drafting it and the other person sort of editing it and helping and using their name and everything. If it's a legitimate co-production, like we're editing each other's words back and forth, editing each other's story. Like I'll tell him if this doesn't work, or he tells me if that doesn't work. Like it helped us own our skills a lot. Of course, we did that. We've done like 10+ books, so
right.
it took a lot of work, but just that constant feedback rather than writing in a vacuum
Yeah,
can really help. But again, like sometimes if you just write a book and release it on Amazon, you don't get that level of feedback, and that's fine if you're selling.
yeah.
So there's different schools of thought on it, but if you want to really own your skills, I think it can take a lot of feedback and going back and forth with things before you put it out into the marketplace.
When you're friends and working together, does that make it difficult to like be honest about certain things, or are you guys like, no, we want you to be honest? If there was no hurt feelings in here when there's being honesty about stuff like
between me
that?
and between me and Steve.
Yeah, or
Yeah,
even
no,
other
I
authors.
think for me and Steve, like, we realized that's why we wrote Luna Missile Crisis so many times. That was our first book together. Is the first version, like, we didn't really know each other, so we were timid and scared to say anything
Yeah,
rough, or have someone rewrite a scene or anything like that. And then I think it was after like four Barry got us like a books that we went and rewrote it, where we were both like, okay, like now we can really tell each other what's what. Um, as a publisher, if I need to tell someone how to fix something or something like that, at this point, I feel like we have enough of a reputation for being author first and wanting to do best by them that they trust
yeah,
when we're telling them things. But again, we're not the type of publisher that's going to tell them, no, you need to change this, this, and this, and this. Otherwise, we're not publishing it.
yeah,
No, like, our goal is to perfect the story they want to tell. Otherwise, we wouldn't have signed it.
right,
And again, 99% of the time, that's what the big four is after too. They don't want to do all this huge developmental editing work. It costs
right,
a lot of money. They want to perfect what you want to say, and that's what editing should be for us. Um, you know, the situations where we need to tell someone to take something out tend to be if there was a copyright issue, or it's just something so R-rated we don't feel comfortable publishing it
yeah,
and stuff. And that tends to be more awkward than other conversations where we think we can help them improve something, because we've done this a lot, and we feel like we've earned the right to at least be able to have that open dialogue.
yeah.
If they say no, it's, and they have good reason, it's fine. But at least we want to be honest and put forth ideas that'll help.
That's awesome. Again, your upcoming book series, the Eighth Continent series, is you just had one come out September 19th. You got another one in October. You got another one in November from that series, right?
Yeah,
Do you have
every
dates on those?
30 days or so. I picked them so long. It's like every 4 weeks or so.
Okay. Okay.
So I want to say October 26th,
Okay.
and then November 21st or something like
Yeah.
that.
But don't quote you on it,
But
guys. If you're listening, don't
no,
quote
don't
him
quote
on
me on it.
it.
I
Somewhere
said
around
it.
there.
It's like every 4 month in Amazon time, and we release on Tuesdays. So yeah, we're quick releasing it again. It was something we prepped for a long time so we could give this a try. It's something that does work well. A lot of authors do, but it's cool for readers, right? They get to read a whole series really fast.
Yeah, that's a popular way of doing things. You'd be surprised how many authors we've had from multiple different companies. Like, boom, 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 boom. I
Oh,
do
it's
better if I do them, get them out real quick. So
we prefer it every time. So
awesome, awesome. Of course, everyone can find all of the books from all of the authors at athonbooks.com, or they can find all of your stuff at rhettbruno.com, correct? Don't put the C in
yep.
there, people. Just Rhett Bruno. I made that mistake typing it in once, and I was like, it's not coming up.
Really, I should probably buy the other one too.
Yeah, maybe. That's on you.
and
That's on
and
you.
and forward it. Yeah.
They can find you on Twitter, RC Bruno44. Is that correct?
Yep.
Facebook, /author Rhett C Bruno on Facebook, and at RC Bruno Author on Instagram. Did I get all of them?
Yeah, if you search Rhett, usually it's just me.
There you go.
Rhett and author together. There's
Right.
not many.
I think there's an actress with Rhett too that pops up. I could
You'll
be
find
wrong.
a Rhett and Link book, the band or whatever, but that's about it.
Awesome. Listeners, I also want to remind you that the podcast is not the only show we do. We also do a live stream only show as well. It's called Off the Pod. It's usually a 3-hour, fully interactive show. It is also on Mondays, the opposite Mondays of the podcast. Next week on Off the Pod, we're going to be joined by author Michelle Franklin. She does a lot of awesome stuff on all the social media. Her books are hilarious, great kids' books as well. So, what happens in that show is every 20 minutes, our topics change and we talk about a new topic. We're going to be talking Celtic mythology, video games, and cheese. That's going to be weird, but it's going to be a lot of fun next Monday with author Michelle Franklin. As far as the podcast goes, our next podcast episode is live October 9th with New York Times bestselling author and actor Wesley Chu. That's going to be available for download on October 10th. That's not to mention all of our other future guests, such as author Heather Harris, game designer Connor Alexander, and Monty Cook Games owner Shanna Germain, and so many more. So like, follow, rate, review, push all the buttons, push them all, and say the nicest things about us. For Rhett C Bruno, I am Nick, and I want to thank you all for listening to Epic Realms.